All right, welcome everyone. This is our 21st episode of the Spiky Signal Show, where I sit down with some of the most exceptional revenue leaders in the revenue space. The podcast is meant for all of us to explore the biggest problems facing customer facing teams, share the real challenges of sales and what revenue leaders deal with on an everyday basis, from pipeline visibility to coaching to deal velocity. We share it all here. I'm your host, Waleed Shaarani, head of revenue over at Spiky.ai, and today I'm here with Lacy Miles, director of sales at HalistaPlan. And today we're talking about when empathy becomes a competitive advantage. And this is a really interesting topic because I feel like a lot of the episodes we've done here has been mostly focused on like the technology and the whole AI world and all of this stuff. But I think, leadership really comes down to the core of being a servient and empathetic leader, right? So, and you can really use that as a competitive advantage. So I'm excited to do that. Lacey, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, why don't you just give us a quick elevator pitch on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. In my day to day life, I have two little ones. So, I have a 4-year-old and an almost 2-year old running around to keep up with. I also am a women's tackle football player. So, I know that kind of spins out sometimes, but it's a lot of fun. Go look it up if you're not familiar. And then in my professional life, I lead sales teams. For the past 10 years or so, I've been in SaaS and tech sales. Did it myself for a bit, but have been leading teams and a lot of building teams and organizations for about the past 8 years. I usually am working with companies somewhere between like a Series A up to a Series B when I first start, and then of course have seen them grow from there as well.
That's awesome. No, I'm really excited to get into it. So let's kind of like dive into that. What you've been from like Series B to Series C's, um, like does the definition of empathy or how you lead a team change depending on the team size? I know when it starts to get bigger, it starts to become a little harder or challenging, I guess, to be a little bit more empathetic because you have so many people to lead, and that personalization or that connection is hard to make. So I guess like as these teams were scaling, or you were scaling teams, how did that definition of empathy change, or did it not change at all?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say you're right. It gets harder, right? Especially as you add in even just one extra person that changes the dynamic of the whole team. And then when you think about managing managers, you have to think how they're going to be managing their teams or how you're still staying relevant to those reps. So I think a couple of things. Hiring is super important, right? I look for empathy in hiring, or at least talk about the types of teams I plan to build and I like to build, so that we can make sure we kind of test for that in the beginning. And then as you're coaching and training, and basically in your everyday, making sure you're instilling some of those empathetic natures or values within your management team is super important. And then, of course, if I'm not a CRO, but if you're a CRO, of course, you're not going to be able to go cold call with a team every day, right? But I do think it's important to get your hands dirty every so often so that you can feel that day to day they're experiencing, and then they see you doing their job. They know you're still in tune with what's relevant. I would say the main thing I've seen actually change how you bring empathy into your day to day is where the team stands. Is it a performing team? Is it an underperforming team? Are you building and scaling? Are you staying and just kind of keeping things running? That can actually change it a lot more, in my opinion.
Got it. So let's double click on that. So with like an underperforming team versus an overperforming team, how does that, like, how would you deal with those two teams? Is like the underperforming team a little bit more, giving a little bit more understanding, or like what does that look like? I guess I'd be
Yeah.
interested to kind of learn more about the variations between the two.
Yeah, if I've come into underperforming teams, and that's one of the things I like to do is join teams when they're underperforming and helping them turn around. Often I find that empathy is just not there. So just getting started and bringing it in. And empathy can look different, and we might dive into that, maybe some misconceptions around what empathy is. But a lot of what I think about when coming into an underperforming team and bringing empathy is just listening, right? When I've come into teams, a lot of the reps either don't feel heard, and it doesn't mean you're going to tell them they're right or you're going to implement everything they say, right? But they just want to feel heard, and then you can come back and say, I understand what you're saying. I can see that perspective, but we're not able to do that. And then this is why. Sometimes you can give the full why, sometimes you can't. But I think that is missing often. People want to understand why, and then they can change their mindset or their expectations going forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Have you been a part of like organizations that kind of categorize empathy as a nice to have instead of a competitive edge? And what do you where do you see the competitive edge there, definition around having an empathetic leader?
Yeah, I definitely have. I think a couple of things. Most people believe it's a nice to have. I think that comes from the perceived expectation that sales is cutthroat, right? That everything in sales, it's just leaders, managers, the company, they see a goal and they don't see the human behind it. Um, in my opinion, it should be a more multifaceted approach where you're actually leading the team and coaching them on all aspects, not just the sell itself, which is where it becomes a competitive advantage. In my opinion, there's a couple of things that empathy can unlock into making your reps and your revenue following behind better. One is just their mindset, right? Like it can sound really simple, but if you don't have empathy and you have reps who, I manage everything from SDRs to enterprise reps. SDRs, their first job out of college, they're nervous, they don't know what to ask, right? But if you have somebody who's even just thinking, can I take a half day on Friday or should I like block my calendar with a doctor's appointment because I'm nervous to ask for a half day, right? That is a mental unlock that if you can just get that away, that they can sell better and they can learn more and you can coach at a higher level. And then secondly, I think it comes into play of when you lead with empathy and you build that true trust, people work harder, in my opinion, and then drive more revenue as well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious to see or hear your perspective. Do you think that kind of relaying that empathy to the team directly correlates to them being empathetic towards prospects and customers? Like, I guess that's kind of the nurture versus nature kind of debate there, right? So, what have you seen before in the past?
I think it can. I think that can be influenced. I do think some people more of that, like some people are born with more empathetic tendencies and things like that. I think your upbringing, maybe has you influence in different directions. But I do also think it can be coached and more importantly, modeled or demonstrated. So, yes, I think that they can feel empowered to bring more empathy into their sales process. And then you can model that as well, right? When they bring a deal to you and they're talking about something and you're trying to get strategic, if it should involve empathy, it can, right? So, an example is the company I work for, we offer a free trial. After the free trial, you convert, of course, to a customer. Recently, during the holidays, we had people who would convert on either Christmas Eve or Christmas. So, to try to be a bit more empathetic in that sales process, we actually called them and emailed them ahead of time and said, hey, unless you want to work, of course you can, but it's the holidays. I'm sure you want to be with your family. We're going to go ahead and extend that trial to the following Monday. So, it's a very simple example, but it's an empathetic way to gain trust and build longer term customers at the same time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, with that example, it may, I guess, slow down some deals, right? But does that equate to maybe winning more? Because now you become a lot more personal with like the person that you're working with on the deal type of thing versus just someone who's trying to sell you and is cutthroat. What are your kind of thoughts there?
Yeah. So I think one, you need to use it strategically, right? So in our favor this year, we could do that and it still landed in December, right? So it might have been a slightly different talk track or approach if it was, going to push it out to January. So there's ways in that case, it doesn't matter if it's slowed it down by 2 days because it's still hitting our revenue in the same space. I do think that some people think being empathetic slows down the deal process. I actually think it speeds it up. And again, for a couple of reasons. More empathetic people can typically build that rapport and trust faster. So if you can build that rapport and trust faster, you're going to be able to get to what are the actual objections, what are the actual things we need to overcome before someone can buy, and have better, real conversations to overcome them. And then secondly, I another misconception in my opinion around empathy is if you're empathetic, you can't also challenge or negotiate, right? And I actually again think that's the opposite. You can come and you can challenge stronger because again, you've built that relationship, you've built that empathy, they understand you're a human already. And when you're challenging them, you almost become more of an advisor saying like, hey, I hear you want to push this, but you told me yesterday you have this goal, and if we push it, X, Y, and Z will happen. How do we make sure you hit your goals? Right? So I think people kind of equate empathy to being softer, and that actually isn't the case.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense and really interesting perspective so far. So a lot of the times, especially when it comes to like a sales leader or even like a revenue leader, like a CRO, they're often measuring performance based off of like metrics and KPIs. Empathy is hard to do that, to measure that type of stuff, right? So what metrics have you seen that closely align with that? Is it NPS scoring? Like, what exactly does that look like?
Yeah, good question. And I think in all of these questions, there's kind of two parts. There's the empathy with your employees, and then there's the empathy with your
Yeah.
prospects or clients, right? On the prospects and clients side, I think NPS score, renewal rates, all of those pieces are very important to measuring that. And then on the employee side, I think things like employee retention rates, attainment as well, I think is kind of goes into that empathetic side. And then this one's a little bit harder to measure, I suppose, but if your team is actually working as a team versus working against each other.
Yeah, makes sense. Have you been a part of like any teams that have gone through like rounds of layoffs and such? Like in my experience, like, back in the day, a couple of years ago, I've been part of companies that have had two, three rounds of layoffs, and it's hard to keep morale up, especially within like the revenue side of things. When a lot of their aspects or motivation is tied to quota attainment and all of these different types of metrics. But have you been a part of any organizations that go through this? And if so, when they do, how do you maintain that morale and be empathetic with your team?
Yeah, I know there's some orgs where it's, hey, every year at the end of the year, we're going to cut our bottom 20% no matter what year over year. I've not been a part of an org in that fashion, probably just by nature of the size of companies I'm working for. You're typically, smaller. I have been, I was working in the tech space during COVID, so I definitely had been through rounds of layoffs that were initially prompted from that. It's a couple of things. One, I believe if it's not COVID or some sort of tragedy related, you should just be performance managing all the time. Not just wait till that end of year. We're going to move people out if they're the bottom 20%. If you're performance managing in real time, I think it's easier to keep up that morale because other people see that performance, right? And then if you're keeping underperformers for too long, your high performers will start to do worse because they're discouraged. But during the actual layoffs, it's hard, right? You're totally right. It's hard. I think a couple of things. Sometimes that empathy part comes in, and again, of just people wanting to talk or be heard. If I've ever have to give a hard change with my team, I'll usually just get them all in a room, physically or virtually, and be like, what's on your mind? Like, let's just talk about it. Let's get it all out. Let's just give you all a chance to say without me responding. And then they start to interact with each other as well. And then at the end of that, it might be like, I hear you. And unfortunately, we still need to now go and do our job. And this is like how we're going to do it. But I find that just giving them space to say what's on their mind helps, again, kind of unlock that out of weighing on their brain in the future.
Yeah, makes sense. Um, how does this look like when you're managing upwards? Because like there's a lot of the times where you do have to be understanding of your manager, based off of like if they're treating you wrong or they're going through a bad day, right? Like you need to kind of understand that positioning and try to work around that to still be, a good a good, what is it called? Like employee or subordinate. I don't like using that word, but um, yeah, but kind of like we kind of covered like all the aspects of managing down, but I guess what does that look like managing up?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're totally right. Everyone has a hard day, right? And they might act differently on that day. I think having a base level, unless you're brand new to working with them, having a base level helps. So if they come in and they're acting a little bit different, you might just know like, hey, it must be an off day for them. I'm gonna kind of tread lightly or do whatever makes sense there. Um, I also think having direct conversations helps with that empathy down the road. So, if I feel it's just like in a sales cycle, if I feel anything's off, instead of ignoring that, it's like let's attack it head on. Like, hey, something feels off here. You're micromanaging me all of a sudden, or whatever it is, right? Am I missing, or is there something I'm not performing? I like to try to phrase it as inward. Maybe I'm doing something incorrect. And then there's gonna be times where like you just aren't a fit, right? And if I think something that took a while for me to learn throughout my career is there's definitely some things that I don't want from a manager. And I don't need, a high level of empathy, but there has to be some sort of understanding. You and I talked about our kids earlier. Like, if my kid's sick and I have to take time to get them out of school, like that has to be a possibility. I'll get my work done in the evening when they go to bed or whatever that is, right? Like if that's not possible, then it's just not the right fit. And sometimes you run into that too.
Yeah, yeah, I've had a lot of experiences and heard of a lot of people that, like sometimes some managers they don't have kids and they don't really have anything outside of work, and it's hard for them to understand when, a someone that's under them like has some family stuff that's going on. It takes, and that's where the coaching aspect I think comes into play. Like you can learn that even if you can't put yourself in the shoes of others, you can still learn that and be a servant leader.
Yeah.
Um, I totally get that point.
Yeah,
Um,
I was that way before my not that intense, but like I
yeah,
didn't quite comprehend what it meant to have a sick kid prior to having kids either. So totally get it.
yeah, totally. Same here. Like like a lot of our friends, ever since we got a kid, they're like, and they don't have kids, they're like, hey, like, why don't you just, drop them off somewhere or like, just come out. Like it's okay. Like, but and even if they're not sick, like sometimes we just don't want to leave our kids. I don't know. So
Yeah.
yeah, totally. Everything changes when you have kids. It's crazy. But yeah. So just last kind of question around this topic, and just to close this out soon, for a leader like a CRO who wants to make empathy a true differentiator next quarter, for example, where should they start?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it depends on where their level of empathy is today, right? But I think two things, and it kind of goes along with, if you're turning around an underperforming team. Um, One, make sure you have a good gauge on where things stand today. So if you haven't in a while, make sure you're doing your one-on-ones with your leadership team as much as you can. Of course, depends on how large your team is. Do it with some of those reps as well. And I think some people only will do it with high performing reps. I do think it's important to maybe do it with at least one like mid-tier rep and one lower performing rep so you get the full perspective before you start to decide where you're going to invest. Um, and then, of course, when you're doing that, you're also kind of fact checking against what your leadership group is saying versus what your reps are saying to make sure you kind of have reality there. And you might also be doing that cross functionally too. So I think just getting informed and making sure you're covering any of your potential gaps is important there. Um, and then depending on how you're going to include it, so I'll give you an example of like building out goals, right? If we have Q4 goals, I want to have empathy come into hitting those goals. I like to get buy-in from the beginning. So empathy, in my opinion, looks like, okay, I'm going to bring my leaders in earlier than I would have as we're planning those goals out, as we're planning our attack to get there. Have them give some input. Sure, I might take that away and have to adjust it a little bit, right? But I've given them a chance to give input. They feel like they're involved. And then when we roll it out to the team, again, getting some sort of that like opt in from them to say, like, yes, I agree. Yes, we're going to jump in. We're going to do this. I think that conviction is very important to keep the momentum in sales. And especially in those harder times, like we talked about earlier, but it's also a part of that empathetic atmosphere that helps you build, basically build a sales org for sustainable growth at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's great. Makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much, Lacey, for kind of spending the time with us and speaking on this topic. And I always close this out with this last question. And you don't have to answer it now, you can email me. But for the next episode, who do you think would be a great revenue leader to bring on here?
Oh, great question. Well, I don't know all the people who have been on your podcast, but two people I would suggest are my CRO from Carta, Jeff Perry. He's great. He's at a much larger company, leading a much larger org. And then another one that is more well known in the space. Haven't talked to him in a while, but worked with him at Carta as well as Armand, who runs 30 Minutes to President's Club podcasts and books, if you've not heard of them.
Awesome. Awesome. Great. Well, yeah, I'll definitely reach out to both of them and see if they'd be interested in joining. But again, thank you so much for being on the podcast with me, Lacey.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thanks for having me.